Canada's not doing well. They're doing very poorly. And you can't look at China as the answer.
A single post on social media set off a chain reaction that rippled through the American business aviation sector. In just a few lines, the announcement introduced the idea of sweeping 50% tariffs on all Canadian-manufactured aircraft sold in the United States, alongside the threat of withdrawing certification for planes already flying. What had long been a quiet, highly technical system of aviation regulation was suddenly pulled into the center of a political confrontation. The catalyst was Canada's refusal to accelerate safety approvals for Gulfstream's newest aircraft models. These jets have not yet completed mandatory fuel icing system tests, a requirement designed to ensure fuel continues flowing reliably in extreme conditions. Instead of waiting for those tests to conclude, the response was an ultimatum. Approve the aircraft immediately or face economic and regulatory consequences. Before continuing, if you find value in detailed reporting that explains how policy decisions reshape entire industries, take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It helps ensure in-depth analysis like this continues to reach a wider audience. The market reaction was swift and unforgiving. Bombardier's share price dropped sharply within hours, reflecting investor anxiety rather than any change in the company's underlying fundamentals. Major U.S. airlines were suddenly pressed with questions about fleets built in Canada. Private jet owners began calculating worst-case scenarios in which aircraft worth tens of millions of dollars could be grounded overnight. Aviation law firms reported a surge in calls from clients seeking clarity in a situation where clarity no longer existed. What the threat overlooked was how deeply intertwined Canadian aircraft manufacturing is with the American aviation ecosystem. More than half of Bombardier's aircraft worldwide are based in the United States. Roughly 64% of the company's sales come from American customers. Thousands of U.S. suppliers, spread across nearly every state, manufacture engines, avionics, structural components, and systems that make up most of the value of each aircraft. A move aimed at Canada instantly placed American jobs and businesses in the line of fire. For decades, global aviation has depended on a framework of mutual trust. The United States certifies its aircraft, Canada certifies theirs, Europe does the same, and each authority validates the other's findings. This system works because safety decisions are insulated from politics. Once certification becomes a bargaining chip, that foundation begins to crack. The moment economic pressure overrides engineering judgment, confidence in the entire system erodes. At the heart of the dispute are Gulfstream's G700 and G800 business jets. Their fuel systems differ from earlier designs, routing fuel in new ways that require additional testing to ensure ice crystals cannot form and obstruct flow at high altitude. Such testing exists because fuel icing has contributed to past aviation accidents. The U.S. regulator granted a temporary exemption, allowing limited operations while testing continues. Canadian regulators declined to do so, citing safety obligations rather than trade considerations. That divergence became the basis for retaliation. The threat was not narrowly targeted. It extended to every aircraft manufactured in Canada and operating in the United States. This included business jets, regional airliners, turboprops serving smaller communities, and even commercial aircraft integral to airline schedules. Implementing such a move would require grounding more than 5,000 aircraft, disrupting flight schedules nationwide, stranding passengers, and eliminating air service to dozens of smaller cities. The private aviation market faced an even starker risk. Hundreds of Canadian-built business jets registered in the United States represent tens of billions of dollars in asset value. Loss of certification would instantly render them unusable and unsellable, disrupting corporate travel, charter operations, and financing arrangements. Even the possibility of such action was enough to freeze purchasing decisions and inject fear into a market that depends on predictability. Ironically, the threat strengthened Bombardier's competitive position. Its flagship Global 8000 had already completed full certification in Canada, the United States, and Europe without exemptions. In the ultra-long-range business jet market, buyers suddenly saw a clear contrast. One aircraft fully approved everywhere through completed testing, and another dependent on regulatory waivers and political pressure. In an industry where safety and reliability define value, that distinction matters deeply. The consequences extend well beyond aircraft manufacturers. Bombardier relies heavily on American manufacturing capacity. Thousands of U.S. workers are employed directly at its facilities, with tens of thousands more supported through its supplier network. Any sustained loss of market access would reduce production volumes, cut orders, and ripple through states where aerospace employment is a critical economic pillar. A move framed as protecting American industry instead placed it at significant risk. From Canada's perspective, the stance is firm by necessity. Aviation authorities are legally obligated to prioritize safety above all else. Granting exemptions under political pressure would undermine regulatory integrity and create long-term legal exposure. Once a precedent is set, future manufacturers would demand similar treatment, eroding standards permanently. Canadian regulators face a simple choice: uphold safety requirements or compromise the system they are tasked with protecting. Globally, the reaction has been one of concern. International aviation depends on predictable, apolitical certification rules. If one country begins revoking approvals for economic leverage, others gain justification to do the same. That threatens aircraft exports, disrupts global travel, and places manufacturers in a cycle of retaliatory restrictions. For an industry built on international cooperation, this represents a fundamental risk. Several outcomes remain possible, and none are without consequence. Full enforcement would damage American airlines, suppliers, and aircraft owners more than foreign competitors. A retreat would weaken future leverage and credibility. Partial measures would distort markets without resolving the underlying dispute. Even a negotiated compromise would leave lingering doubts about the independence of safety oversight. As uncertainty drags on, pressure is likely to come from within the United States rather than from abroad. Airlines operate on long planning cycles, often committing to aircraft purchases and fleet strategies years in advance. They depend on regulatory consistency to manage maintenance schedules, training programs, and route planning. When certification rules appear vulnerable to political shifts, that planning framework begins to break down. Delays and ambiguity translate directly into higher costs, operational inefficiencies, and increased risk exposure. Suppliers feel the strain just as quickly. Aerospace manufacturing relies on precise forecasting, with production lines calibrated to expected demand months or even years ahead. Unpredictable policy introduces hesitation at every level of the supply chain. Orders are postponed, hiring slows, and capital investments are deferred. For an industry that thrives on stability and scale, even short-term uncertainty can disrupt workflows that took decades to refine. Business jet buyers face a different but equally damaging dilemma. These aircraft represent long-term investments tied to financing agreements, resale values, and global mobility. The possibility that regulatory status could change due to political pressure undermines confidence not just in a specific aircraft, but in the broader market environment. Buyers begin to favor manufacturers and jurisdictions perceived as insulated from political interference, even if that means higher upfront costs or longer delivery timelines. As this dynamic persists, alternative manufacturers and markets inevitably become more attractive. European and Asian aerospace firms, operating under more insulated regulatory frameworks, gain an advantage simply by offering predictability. Over time, purchasing decisions shift not because of performance differences, but because stability itself becomes a competitive feature. Once that shift occurs, reclaiming lost market confidence becomes far more difficult than preserving it in the first place. What began as a tactic to force regulatory concessions instead exposed the fragility of politicizing technical systems. Aviation certification is built on decades of engineering discipline, data-driven testing, and international trust. Introducing political leverage into that process weakens the entire structure. Rather than isolating a foreign competitor, the move injected uncertainty into American aviation itself, affecting companies, workers, and consumers who rely on the system functioning without interference. In a sector where trust, safety, and reliability are paramount, uncertainty is the most damaging outcome of all. Aircraft are designed to operate for decades, crossing borders and jurisdictions daily. When the rules governing their approval appear unstable, the ripple effects extend far beyond any single dispute. The long-term cost is not measured only in delayed deliveries or lost contracts, but in eroded confidence that can take years to rebuild. In an industry where trust and reliability are foundational, prolonged uncertainty becomes more corrosive than any single regulation or tariff. Aviation functions on shared expectations. That rules will be applied consistently, that safety decisions are insulated from politics, and that certifications granted today will still be valid tomorrow. When those assumptions weaken, the entire system absorbs the shock. Over time, this erosion of confidence reshapes behavior. Airlines diversify fleets to reduce exposure. Buyers delay purchases or shift to jurisdictions perceived as more stable. Foreign regulators become more cautious in accepting U.S. certifications, adding layers of review that slow deliveries and increase costs. None of this happens overnight, but once it begins, it is difficult to reverse. The deeper consequence is strategic. American aviation has long benefited from being seen as the anchor of the global system, the reference point others trust. Undermining that perception doesn't just create short-term disruption. It gradually pushes influence elsewhere. Markets adapt, supply chains reroute, and leadership quietly shifts to those who offer predictability. In the end, uncertainty achieves what competitors never could on their own. It weakens confidence from within, drains momentum from innovation, and turns a position of strength into one of hesitation. In aviation, where stability is power, instability is not leverage, it is loss. If this analysis helped clarify the stakes behind the headlines, remember to like this video and subscribe for more in-depth coverage. These decisions shape global industries long after the initial announcement fades from view.